Ever so much, Kevin. I'm going to now try and do my technicalities of sharing my screen, which I'm hoping is working for you. So good morning, everybody. And first of all, thank you ever so much to the National Student Engagement Programme, to studentsurvey.ie and to QQI for this fantastic opportunity to speak with you this morning. The one downside of speaking this morning is that I have to follow Sophia and Lucy's wonderful presentation, and also from student comments and presentations previously. So that's the challenge, but I will do my best. So as Kevin has said, my kind of intention this morning is to try to ask a provocative question of whether we might be considered negligent if some students don't get to experience partnership. So if I can start by suggesting that I think most of us would understand partnership in different ways, and we might define it in different ways, and certainly Sophia and Lucy suggested that we often use different terminology, and when we think of partnership we perhaps think of different things. So in some work that I did about a year ago, I actually tried to create what I've called a typology in order to think about what kinds of partnership and co-creation we're doing. I use the term co-creation quite a lot, and I'll come on to that shortly as to why. And so just to give you a few examples within that typology, these are the kinds of questions I'm asking. What is the context for co-creation? So is it something that's seen as curricular? Is it extracurricular? Is it university-wide? Have you selected students from a larger group? So students that are involved in that partnership, are they selected and perhaps interviewed for their role? Are they or are they being invited as a whole group or a class of students to be involved? And what's the nature of that involvement? Are students being informed, consulted, involved? Are they partners, or are they leading the work? And what is the nature of any reward or recompense that students might receive? Do they get paid? Do they receive some vouchers or perhaps some course credit? Perhaps they're not paid, or in some cases students receive refreshments. And each of those different kinds of reward or recompense have implications for students in terms of their ability to participate, and there are all sorts of questions we might ask about inclusivity depending on whether students are being paid or not and the nature of their involvement. So there are lots of other questions within that typology that I've produced, but in a sense it's there so that we can really see some of the patterns of different kinds of partnership. So you can imagine if we had a university-wide partnership initiative that involved a selected group of students, and those students are perhaps working as partners and they're perhaps being paid for that piece of work. That's going to be quite different from a curricular partnership involving a whole class of students who perhaps are involved but not always perhaps at a level we would describe as partnership, and they're receiving course credit for that rather than being paid. You can see immediately that's just two examples, but that you can end up with quite a range of different kinds of partnership out there. So I think we do need to be careful when we're talking about partnership. What sorts of partnership are we talking about? In this quote from a book that I was involved in writing a few years ago now with some American colleagues, we came up with this definition of partnership specifically within learning and teaching. And this has been a quotation that I think has been referred to quite a lot within other people's writing and within the literature. I think one of the things I want to draw attention to here is that we highlight that often within partnership, this is about partners contributing equally, but importantly in this, not necessarily in the same ways. And so I think partnership within this definition, that one of the key parts of that is about, we can collaborate, but unless we're kind of contributing in equal ways and we have some sort of equal respect underpinning that, we have to sort of question, is that really partnership? And so that's led me very much to try to kind of distinguish between some different terminology. And so these are terms, and I'm looking at this very much within learning and teaching at this stage, hence why I've included the term active learning. But just to try and distinguish three kind of terms that you might see very regularly, but what is the difference between them? Because there's clearly overlap between these terms. And so if we look at something like active learning, that's involving students very much and meaningfully within teaching and learning. And so there's an implication of interaction going on between students and staff and between students and students. But it probably doesn't imply the level of equality that we're talking about when we say partnership. And so there is a distinct difference between those, and yet partnership also involves and requires interaction to take place. And then if we go in the middle somewhere there, co-creation, a term I quite like using a lot, I think as well as there being interaction, the difference between active learning and co-creation might be around the expectation in co-creation for there to be shared decision making and there to be negotiation of decisions that are taking place. And so that's in addition to that interaction that might be taking place in active learning. So I'm not convinced that active learning always includes shared decision making and negotiation, for example. And similarly, you would say for partnership, that also involves shared decision making and negotiation, but I'm not sure that co-creation necessarily involves the equality that's implied. And my point for distinguishing those is that often I speak to staff and students around universities around the world, and people say, you know, I'm doing this piece of work, but I'm not convinced that it can be called partnership. And I think really to free people up a little bit to say, it may not be partnership, but what you're doing is incredibly meaningful, and you are building these incredible relationships between staff and students. And there is a real shift of power. And there is shared decision making going on. So rather than getting caught up on, you know, can I call it partnership because actually I assess the students at the end of the course, or can I call it partnership because I'm a staff member and I'm being paid to sit on this committee, but perhaps the student rep is not being paid, then I think in some ways that's where co-creation can be a helpful term to sort of free us up of some of that. However, so I will sort of move between those terms a little bit this morning. So a little bit of a shift into the start of me, why I'm asking this question about whether we can be considered negligent. So back in 2014, there was a very interesting article that was published by Freeman et al. And it's based in science, engineering, technology and maths, STEM kind of subjects. And they did a big literature review where they looked at all the evidence for active learning and the positive impacts that come from active learning. And they very creatively, in my view, they asked a provocative question of, it's trying to say, if active learning evidence was seen as, if active learning was seen like a medical treatment, then we would, like, basically with the evidence that exists to date, we would stop any control in a trial because we know that the treatment is effective. And so in a sense, we would be seen as ethically questionable if we continue to not offer that treatment to somebody. And so if we think about that in terms of active learning, they're suggesting it's ethically questionable to continue lecturing without actually having active learning as part of it. And so that got me to thinking about partnership in a little bit more detail. So let's think about the evidence that exists for partnership and whether we might be also potentially considered to be negligent. So some of the partnership evidence that's sort of growing that's out there is there's certainly evidence suggesting that partnership leads to enhanced engagement, enhanced motivation, and these are benefits, I should state, that from this work from Cooksader, myself and Felton in the States, that we found these outcomes for both staff and students. Which I always think is very interesting and perhaps goes against what people think. They think, you know, these are the benefits for students, but actually we were seeing these as shared across staff and students. So enhanced engagement and motivation, but also excitingly, I think, real enhancement of metacognition. So students really report that they gain insights into how they learn and learning how to learn in more effective ways. They gain a greater confidence and sense of identity through partnership practices, and we see enhanced classroom practices. And you can see for staff that kind of enhanced metacognition often comes through working with students in partnership tends to lead you to question why you teach in the way that you teach. Alongside that evidence, growing evidence also came at a similar time actually in terms of publication, but the Healy, Flint and Harrington work that was done for the Higher Education Academy, which was an overview of partnership, also drew together further evidence, and there was an international literature review in 2017 which actually Lucy and Sophia, who have just presented, were both authors on that literature review, drawing together kind of growing evidence of the impacts of partnership. And we've seen also a burgeoning of new journals where there's just growing evidence in a whole range of different kinds of evidence for benefits of partnership. And here's a different form of evidence. So a quote from a student here, and this is actually now from about 10 years ago, some early partnership work. But to this day, Stephen is the only teacher who has asked me what I wanted to get out of taking class, ever. I had never even thought about it. I grew up thinking what I assumed every other student thought, and the majority of students still think. What do I want to get out of class? An A. The thought of actively trying to learn something never crossed my mind. I find that powerful every time I read it, in terms of the importance of us actually connecting with students enough to have conversations and actually, in this case, work in partnership, but to start to really engage and motivate students to want to get something from their learning. Another quote, not quite so positive, that I'm putting up here. This is a quote from the UK National Student Survey. And I suspect it's not the only quote like that we see in sort of qualitative comments. But I saw this comment and I just, it really kind of moved me in a way to feel, on what level is that acceptable? Is it ever acceptable for a staff member to be rude to a student? And what this made me realise is we have a lot of work to do. So I think there's a step back almost from partnership to say, are we doing the basics of actually being respectful to one another? Are we doing the basics of building good relationships with one another? And so I found this really provocative to think, we've got those lovely quotes, you know, the lovely quote from the student just in the previous slide, suggesting that there's some amazing outcomes from partnership, and yet other students, this is what they're experiencing. And I think, you know, we have work to do here. We also know from work in the States, George Koo, the sort of author of the National Survey of Student Engagement in the States, argues that the more contact there is between students and faculty, both inside and outside the classroom, the greater student development and satisfaction. And so I think the reason I've included this is because it's this reminder that this is not just about what happens within a classroom. This is not just what happens outside the classroom. This is about what happens across a university, inside classrooms, outside classrooms. This involves every staff member in terms of how we create a sense of hospitality with students, and it includes every student. So this is about sort of all being involved. So let's think about these relationships that we need to build in order to not have comments like, you know, staff were rude to me. And there's a huge amount of evidence about the benefits of positive staff-student relationships. So lots of evidence suggesting that where there are positive relationships, students experience far more academic success. They have higher aspirations within for their education. They have greater personal and intellectual development, greater satisfaction, and they have enhanced motivation. And it may not surprise you that connected to that, staff characteristics, attitude and personality are also really important. So staff who are warm and informal, friendly and flexible, accessible, approachable and available, empathetic, genuine, respectful, understanding and honest tend to build better relationships with students. And that might not sound surprising, And that's a bit of a wish list, if you like, if only we could have staff who have all of these characteristics. But it does beg the question, how do we try and create a culture in which we are encouraging staff to adopt certain attitudes and to try and develop certain characteristics in order to create the relationships that are needed for students to feel that they belong at university, but also to enable us to build the foundations for partnership. So in some work that I've done recently in a recent book that I've published, I've actually highlighted one key thing here is within classrooms, particularly, the first 5 minutes is absolutely key. A staff member, a teacher, will communicate to students very, very quickly what kind of relationship they're prepared to build with the students in the room. And whether that's through the tone they take, whether that's through whether they encourage questions, if they ask questions, how they respond to those questions, are they welcoming of the kinds of things students are sharing? Do they encourage students to share anything about themselves? And is the staff member alongside that willing to share some of themselves? And so in those first 5 minutes, students are very astute. They're smart. They will pick up very quickly the kind of attitude and approach that a teacher wants to take. And so if we think about that, every time a teacher meets a new group of students, that is potentially an opportunity to create relationships and form the foundations potentially of partnership. So this is about building trust, respect, community, belonging, and ultimately, I think, showing that we care about students. And that way of thinking about teaching, I think, can also be broadened out to say, let's think about this in the whole of the university. How do we communicate in the first 5 minutes we meet a student? How do we communicate in the first 5 minutes if you're a student that you meet a teacher or another member of staff in the university? How do we communicate within that early encounter that we care, we respect the people around us? Really, really important. One other thing that seems to be really important to students is learning names. There's some absolutely fantastic evidence that's come from Arizona State University in this paper by Cooper et al., where they had a large class of 500 students in a biology class, and they got them to create what they call name tents. So basically a piece of A4 paper folded in half lengthways. They ask students to put their name on the front of it, and it means that then when the teacher wants to ask a question in that class, they can use the student's name in terms of asking that question. It's a small thing, and it's really hard to learn the names if you have 500 students. But it seems to make a big difference, and they've got evidence from since using the name tents that students are basically finding teachers more approachable, they're more likely to come and ask them questions, and the outcomes for the students are also more positive. What I think is the gold dust of this particular study, though, is students are told, I didn't need to tell you, but we know they're smart, and they know that a teacher cannot learn 500 names. But what seems to be statistically significant in this study is not whether the teacher actually remembers the students' names or not. Students say that what was important to them was that the teacher was trying to learn their names and making an effort to call them by their name. So really fascinating evidence that's coming that I think is really important if we're thinking about the importance of building relationships. So I want us to kind of, just as I come to an end here, think about the importance of this being something we think about across a university and changing university culture. So I wanted to tell you two little vignettes, one about somebody who's called Miss Rita here. So this is about a woman called Rita Rillman. She works at Wofford College in South Carolina, and she is the only member of staff at that college to have been awarded an honorary degree from the university. She's known as Miss Rita by the students and the staff. She's seen as a bit of a legend in the university. She's a member of canteen staff, and she remembers all the students' names, and she remembers all the things that they tell her about themselves. So when they go to the canteen and they go and get their baked potato, she remembers and she says, you know, hello, whoever, you know, she'll remember the name, and then she'll say, how's your brother? You know, because maybe the last time you were in, you mentioned that you were worried about your brother and you were going to go and visit him because he hadn't been well. And she remembers those little things. I mean, to me, that's a superpower. I would really struggle to be able to do that, but she has that ability. And I love that the university has recognised that with an honorary degree, because we all need a few more Miss Ritas on campus. We need people who are making that effort. What effort does it take for us to say hello when we pass people in the corridor? So I think, you know, that kind of positive reinforcement that you belong, I think is really important. Another little initiative just to tell you about is at the University of Edinburgh, I implemented a coffee and cake conversations initiative. This was basically pairing up one student and one staff member from a school or a department, and then asking the student to invite two further friends, two students, to join, so that a group of 4 people were going to go out for coffee and cake. We gave them a voucher, said go and have coffee and cake. Here's a few sort of instructions if you want to break the ice. And it had a few questions like, you know, why did you choose to study this subject area? Why are you teaching in this subject area? Tell each other something about yourselves, perhaps that people don't know, but that you'd be willing to share. And then literally instructions that say answer as many or as few of these questions as you want. Essentially just go and have coffee and have a chat. And it doesn't sound like rocket science, but the feedback we got from people was quite overwhelming. So we started getting emails from staff members who said, I did this and it reminded me why I came to teach in higher education. These students were so smart, they were funny, we had such good conversations. We had students who said, I loved hearing about what it's like to see the department from a staff point of view. I loved seeing my lecturer as a human being. We had comments from one group who said, we don't need any more money, but we're going back out next week because we want to carry on the conversations. These were the sorts of things that we heard. And I think, you know, Lucy and Sophia mentioned, there was a statement I wrote down when I was listening to them about partnership makes us human again. And there was a bit of me that says, in this case, relationships really make us human again. And I think I think this is what people were recognizing in the feedback we were given, was just chance and space to go and try and connect on a more human level. So I come to my provocation essentially to say, if we think back to the active learning article that I mentioned, you know, with all that evidence that suggests, you know, if we carry on lecturing without active learning, then we're probably being ethically questionable, and I'm using the word negligent. And so with all the partnership evidence that's growing and the evidence that relationships are important and they are a kind of building block for partnerships, if we're not offering opportunities for relational teaching and for partnership, then maybe I would argue, are we being negligent? And so I leave you with that as my provocation, essentially. I've got a few more slides which basically just have a little plug for my book in case you're interested, and photo credits and some references, but I think colleagues will probably share these with you afterwards. So I'm going to just finish there with the provocation, I think. And I'm hoping I've stopped. Sorry, I've probably shared strange things on screen.
Thank you, Cathy. That was really inspirational, and there was a lot going on in that for me, I have to say, just to bring me into a space